Welcome to this week's lesson. This is a lesson to discuss the way that you can choose tests that you would like to offer to your sample population to determine the data set that you're going to use. So we're going to talk about tests and questionnaires and attitude measurement that you can use. So our objectives are to understand the different types of tests and inventories that are out there and things that you should consider when you are going to select an instrument. You may select one that's already been designed, or you may design your own. And then we're going to understand about the different types of test scores and the advantages and disadvantages of using different types, open test forms, closed, or interviews or focus groups. So when we talk about tests or inventories, a test is when the subject is instructed to do their best and they have a correct or incorrect answer. But in an inventory, you're asked to represent your typical reaction to a particular question. So a test, like I said, has correct or incorrect answers. An inventory measures your opinion or your attitudes. There are no right or wrong answers. Some of you may be familiar with the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Test called the MMPI Strong's Interest Inventory that you've taken to see, what are your interests in life. Some other tests that most of you are probably somewhat familiar with. We have different types of achievement tests that talk about your ability or your proficiency. Commonwealth of Virginia has SOL tests. There's also the Stanford 9 Achievement Test, Iowa Achievement Test, GRE for people who are going into graduate school, SATs, the tests that we have here in class. Then there's also ones that test your mental ability. Stanford Binet is probably the one that most people are familiar with. There's also aptitude tests to show things that you may have a propensity to doing well at. If you ever went in the military, you would know you took the ASVAB to see what potentially would be a good training area for you. We also have what's called an interest inventory, and there's a multitude of those out there. The Virginia Wizard is one that I'm most acquainted with, that we give to students who are in the 11th or 12th grade of public education to see what might be their interest once they matriculate and enter post-secondary education. And then everybody is probably very familiar with the Myers-Briggs, which is a personnel inventory to tell you, what your particular strengths and weaknesses are. So where are the places you can find these tests? There's a lot of tests that are out there, and you see these resources right here. There's a mental measurement yearbook that ODU has that you can use, and then there's also larger databases with information. So if you're going to look at a test that's already been developed, there's some very important things that you want to check. It depends upon what the purpose of your test or inventory is. The date of publication may play into that. If you are trying to determine a participant's or someone in your sample, their ease of use with technology, you would want a more current test, since technology has changed so much in the past couple of years. Also, you want to check the validity, and a very important thing is most of these tests have a cost or a time that the participant has to invest to take the test. Those are very important because a lot of people don't mind participating, but they don't want something that's going to take them more than 30, 45 minutes, an hour. They start to lose interest at that point. So if you go to the ODU library and click on, you see up here, A to Z databases. If you type in tests and measures, you will find 5 databases that include that. Tests and Print is one that is used a lot. Mental Measurements Yearbook, like I told you a few minutes ago, is another. So if you click on Tests and Print, you can come over here and you can choose different categories. So you can narrow your parameters based on what you're looking for. So if I wanted to know about technology and education, I would type it here. I could limit the years of the publication, so I could say I don't want anything that was before 2009 because it won't be valid. I can also look over here and narrow it down if it's a particular type of achievement test, and I can also look at the volume of the yearbook, which is something probably it's a little deeper. It's very similar to just your regular search that you do, that you can put in different fields and limit your search until you find a test. Let me see, I was going to show you, let me click on this and get out. Let's go back to the ODU database. So I'm here at the ODU database. If I go to tests and print and click on it, I can type in technology in education. Well, technology addiction, that might be fun. Technology and education. I can come over here and it gives me a return right here of 6 tests. That's from 1983 to 2014. So I wonder if 2014 is the last year somebody's done a test. Let's see, what happens if I put 2014 to 2014? I only get 1, and that's got to do with assistive technology, so that may not be what I'm looking for. So I may have to go back and change my years for my tests that I want to review. So if I do this and update that, it'll take me back to the tests. So I still got the matching assistive technology, but you could look and you see what the year of the test is. This one is 1991 to 2000, 1991 to 2005. So this one might be a little more current. If I click on the full text, it will tell me what the test has in it. It also tells me the costs of ordering the test and what they are, what this test is attempting to determine. So this is, you see right here, the targeted population includes individuals with physical or sensory disabilities. So this would not be a test that I want because I'm not interested in people with disabilities. So I would go back and look, and this test right here I know because I've looked at it. It tells me that this is just a regular everyday vocational test. It takes 15 to 20 minutes to take it. It does have a rather high cost associated with it. If you want a web-based version that you could just give people the link to fill it out, it would cost you $4.95 per version with a 1-year site license. So you wouldn't want to buy this until you were almost ready to do your test, and then you could buy it and it would be part of your research costs. So these are just important things to know. But as always, if you have a question about a test, the easiest thing to do is ask the education librarian, I can't talk, and she will help you find anything that you're looking for. A lot of times we make our own tests, but these kind of give you some ideas. So I went back to the one that says yearbook test that's at ODU, and it gave me the same results. But it's just an interesting thing to look. Most of you probably know about NOCTI, so here's some NOCTI tests that you could inquire and look into and see what they do. So just a little tidbit of information for you to know about tests that are available. So we're going to talk about the kind of scores that you can get when you do a test or an inventory with your sample population. The first score is your raw score. That's exactly what it sounds like. You haven't touched it. It's the actual raw data from the test. It's original. It's unaltered. The percentile means it's the point of the scale of which a given percentage of scores fall below. So if I told you that your score was in the 90th percentile, that would mean that you scored better than 90% of the people who took the test. We also have what's called the STAY9 scores, also called the Standard 9. And what they do is they just take that bell curve and they divide it up into 9 slices. And they number them from 1 to 9, starting on the left-hand side. So if you have a standard normal distribution, it has a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1, then it means the stanines have a mean of 5 and a standard deviation of 2. So what does a stanine really mean in real plain English? So if you have a score of 9 right here, you're in the top 4% of the people who have scored, while a person with a 1 down here is in the bottom 4%. So these types of scores allow you to easily tell whether the score is below the mean, remember the mean was 5, or above the mean. So we have standard scores. It's a set of scores that have the same mean and standard deviation, so you can compare them. We talk about IQ. We know the mean or average IQ is 100. So a standard deviation is a way of dividing up the standard scores that people have on an IQ test. And it's much easier to see when you have it in a graph form. Then you also have what they call grade level scores. This is where your scores are listed in comparison to your school grade or your academic achievement level. So let's talk about the test, questionnaires, and attitudinal measurements. So when we're going to get information, we often employ a test or a questionnaire. Everybody's probably familiar with the little survey monkey logo. And this is the way that we get information and try to measure it. So when we're talking about a questionnaire, it's a multi-step process. You have to identify what topics or topic that you're going to cover. There's a top 10 list of things that you really need to make sure you include. Make sure every question you ask is necessary. Keep your questions short and simple. Remember the audience that you are writing the questions for, and don't get caught up in using scholarly language or lingo that people may not understand. Ask direct questions. Avoid using qualitative terms like how often. So you wouldn't want to say, how often are you particularly averse to risky situations? Instead, ask a direct question such as, how often do you take risks? Only ask one question at a time and avoid the use of and in your question. So instead of saying what cereal you think is the healthiest and the most delicious, just simply ask, what cereal is your favorite? So questions should be asked in the form in such a way that the respondent is not going to find them objectable. So you got to watch your bias. And like I said earlier, write or speak in the same language as the people who are in your survey. Consider your geographic area within a range of 20 miles. Which of these fast food restaurants is closest in proximity to your residence? Well, if you ask that to some of your participants, especially if they were in a rural setting, or if they were elementary school kids or middle school kids, they may not understand that language. But if you say, which of these fast food restaurants is closest to where you live, that makes it easier to understand. You should use a response scale when possible. Response scales that give direction and the intensity of attitudes give you much richer data. You don't want to ask just true, false, yes or no questions because they don't give you as much information. Avoid using scales that ask respondents to just agree or disagree with statements. Some people are biased toward agreeing with the statements, and this can result in invalid and unreliable data. So you don't want to say true or false, golf is a white-collar sport. You could use a scale instead of just agree or disagree and say, to what degree is golf a white-collar sport? And then they could have a scale of degree. Rephrase your yes and no questions when it's at all possible. And do a test run on your survey to help you catch and correct problems before you distribute it out to your respondents. Obviously, we always want to check grammar and spelling. And like I said again, avoid bias when all possible. So on a questionnaire, we can have different types of items. One is the open form, which most of you are probably very familiar with. It is where you can give a short answer, or you can give your personal response. And this does give you rich data, and it depends upon whether you're doing a quantitative or a qualitative study. But this question, what might your high school have done to prepare you more adequately for college? If that is your primary focus, a qualitative answer is fine, but you want to make sure that you understand how to summarize and tabulate these kind of open responses. A closed form is the one that we are the most familiar with. This one says, the strategies used to teach research methods aided in the preparation of my graduate research paper. I strongly agree, I agree, I'm undecided, disagree, or strongly disagree. One caveat is to always make sure that when you use this scale, to use it the same way, because a lot of people who take surveys and questionnaires get used to it being written this way, and if you flip it, sometimes you can get erroneous data. A little exercise we normally do when we teach this class face-to-face is to practice writing closed-end questions. So I'm going to try to emulate it here. So we're going to pick this topic, which is a rather contentious topic, so it makes writing the questions very interesting. We're going to write 3 closed-end questions about this topic. How effective has President Donald Trump been so far? So they can be inventory or they can be test questions, but you need to provide the responses for the questions. If you have test questions, I used inventory, so mine are on a scale. So I'll give you a minute just to think about that, because it sounds easy until you start to try to write them, and you've got to keep the bias. You got to keep them simple. You got to follow all these rules and make sure they really measure what you're trying to ask. So the first question that I would ask is, to what degree do you agree with this particular statement? President Trump has increased America's economic standing. I strongly agree, I mostly agree, neutral, mostly disagree, or strongly disagree. As of now, are you likely or unlikely to support President Trump for re-election in 2020? Same scale, strongly support, likely support, neutral, not likely to support, or will not support. So it's the same basic scale, just different names to the list. And then the last question I would ask is, do you believe the media wishes to see President Trump fail? So is that strongly agree, mostly agree, neutral, mostly disagree, or strongly disagree? So if we have a closed form, these responses are made by selecting one or more answers, the strongly agree, yes or no. And this type makes it easier for you to analyze the data. But, the biggest thing is I don't have a chance, or the respondent, your sample people, do not have a chance to explain their particular answers. So let's talk about the variables that we're going to use. We need to identify the variables that we're going to have when we do our research. And variables are those simplified portions of the complex phenomena or complex problem that you intend to study. And you need to make sure that you have some way to measure the variables that you are saying make a difference in this particular area of research. So you need to identify them, read up on them, develop a matrix if you need to, so you can say this variable will cause thus and such, and then write your test or your survey based on what you have been able to find about the variable. So here's an example. If you want to talk about someone's ability to drive, there are certain variables. One would be the rules of the road. and you could look that up in a driving manual. The auto mechanics, how does that fit in with the ability to drive, and the auto operations. So these are some examples, and these are some variables that may affect your objective, which is to determine someone's ability to drive. If you're going to do a survey or some type of inventory, you have to have a letter that goes along to let the people know why you are doing this and why you need their response. You also need to remind them that you are protecting their rights as a human subject and the benefits and the risks of participating in this particular survey, the notice of the agency that you're using, and then often you have a follow-up letter or a second follow-up for the survey. So one of the things that you do is an interview. If you conduct interviews, you need to make sure that you check the literature to understand what your limitations might be when you interview someone. There are great advantages to doing interviews. You get much deeper, richer, more individualized responses guided by the questions that you ask, and you also are able to understand the emotions or the emotional side of the particular problem you're looking at. It is a very time-consuming undertaking, and it also depends somewhat on the skill of the interviewer and the instrument that you are using. And think about it, there may be other possible limitations. Some people may be intimidated by the person asking the questions, and so they would change their responses, where if they were doing a survey at home alone where nobody could see them, they might be more open. So these are just, think about the limitations that you have. Like I said, interviews do give you a very rich data pool, but it does require a different way to analyze it. So if you're going to interview somebody, you only ask one question at a time and try to make sure the person really understands what you are asking. And then you have to listen carefully, but you also have to record the person's body language while they're answering the question, and give them plenty of time to answer the question. And this is kind of a hard thing for a lot of us because we're used to talking and being in charge. So having total silence is a little bit tough. And you cannot let the person's answer be reflected in any of your body language or any way that you react, so that you maintain a neutral attitude. And of course, you always ask follow-up questions if they make an answer, if it's necessary. So to summarize what we went over in this week's lesson, we've talked about how you can choose a test, how to design a questionnaire, and how to measure attitude. So let's talk about another way that you can get information, and that's called a focus group. Most of us are very familiar with focus groups because you see them on commercials all the time. There are some that are funny, like with, I can't even think of the name of it now, the car insurance with Flo, or, car manufacturers use a lot of focus groups. They always say, we get these people together and they say, oh, our car is absolutely the best. But here are some things where you bring together a panel and you see what you need to do. But think about what might be some possible drawbacks if you had a focus group. It kind of goes along with doing the interview. It's very time consuming. The data could be slightly slanted because people have a tendency, I think it's called the bandwagon approach. If one person feels strongly about something, as long as it's not a contentious topic, other people have a tendency to want to jump on the bandwagon with them and agree. So you have to be able to understand that phenomena and when it might happen. So we talk about ways that you can measure what we call attitudes or attitudinal. And the first one we have is the Likert scale. I say Likert. Some people say Likert. I'm really not sure what the guy's last name was, but I Likert, I can say. It sounds a little better, but it's a point choice, and it's one you're very familiar with. You see that they still use a spectrum, but the choices are other than just agree and disagree. So sometimes, they can even be more spread out than this, but usually it's a 5-point scale. There's also something called the Thurstone scale, which has 11 points. And you probably are familiar with this. They'll say rate your comments on this. So for the Thurstone, it's called a unidimensional scale that tracks the respondent's behavior, attitude, or feeling towards a statement. It consists of statements about a particular issue or topic where each statement has a numerical value that indicates your attitude toward the topic as favorable or unfavorable. So then you are supposed to take these statements that you agree with, and an average is computed. So it's defined as if you answer 4 out of 11 questions as agree, then that person has a score out of 4 out of 11, or 36%. So the lower the score a person has, the less favorable the opinion. So if a person with a score of 2 views a topic a lot less favorably than a person who would have a score of 8. So remember, it goes from 1 to 11 in this particular scale. So this scale was developed by a gentleman by the name of Robert Thurstone to approximate measurement in equal appearing interval levels. And it's built on the fundamentals of the Likert scale, but this method of constructing an attitude scale not only takes in the value of each item, but it also evaluates the final attitude score, but it also caters to neutral items. There are a couple of other scales out there called the Gutmann and the Bogardus social distance scale. These are other variations of this where you can put things in what we call a hierarchical manner. Then we have what's called the semantic differential scale. And semantic, the root word means words. And so you take these 2 words and you rank your response. If they say... if the question is asking about how do you feel about the facilities at rest stops in Virginia on I-81, you would rank from clean to dirty your response. So let's review a little bit what we've gone over. Remember, we've talked about population. And remember, population is the big N and sample is your little n. And last week we talked about what's a random sample, what's a stratified random sample. Remember, that's when you divide people up. That was the example of the ODU students, male, female, glasses or no glasses. A convenient sample, the people who just happen to be close by, say the Lions Club or the Rotary Club. The purpose-based sample, and volunteers. We talked about validity. What is the construct? What is the content and criterion related validity? We also talked about reliability. How do you know if it's reliable? You have test, retest, parallel forms, and internal consistency. And then we talked about the differences between internal validity, external validity, and extraneous variables. Then today, this week in class, we talked about what makes tests and inventories. What are the different types? You have achievement, mental ability, interest inventory, personality inventory. We talked about GREs, the Stanford 9, the Minnesota Strong's personality, those different types of tests that we have, and the kind of scores that you get out of these tests when you do them. So you can have a raw score, which is totally untouched. You have percentiles, stay nines, which are divided into 9. You have standard scores and grade level scores, where it is compared to their academic level of achievement. So just some reviews. Remember, questionnaires can be open or closed. When you do a questionnaire or any type of survey, you always want to have a cover letter to go out to explain to the participants, your sample group, why you are asking for this information, and a follow-up letter. You can also do interviews or focus groups. What are the different ways of attitude measuring methods like Likert, Thurstone, and semantic differential? And then we have also talked about last week the components that should be in your chapter 3. These components are: you have your introduction, you have your population, you talk about your research variables, and you talk about your instrument design. And remember, when we do the test, pretty much the questions, except for a few that are open response, most of them follow exactly the things that are covered in these lessons. So if you go back and review these lessons prior to completing the test, you should be able to answer the questions easily. I've finished grading test 1. If you have any questions or concerns about it, please feel free to email me and we can discuss it. So this concludes our lesson for week 7.